Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Albright. My name is Jamie Fraser. I'm the director here at the Albright, and such wonderful to see so many of you. For those on Zoom, just so you're aware, it is a particularly cold, dark, and wet night here in Jerusalem. So everybody who's actually made it to the Albright for this lecture, and there's quite a lot of you, double points bonus. I think you can all have an extra help of chocolate cake at the supper afterwards and an extra glass of wine. We come to the end, like a skier in an avalanche, it feels like, of 2025. And with that, we wind up our public program for the year. We've got 2 events next week, and these are our final events for 2025. We then resume again around February in 2026. So we have a little bit of a hiatus. On Monday, we have a more informal lecture. It's called Our Life in Light, Ancient Lamps, Faith and Festivals Illuminated. And that is with Joseph Briffer of the Pontifical Biblical Institute and Benjamin Storken of the IAA. That's going to be followed by a light supper. For those who come for Hisham's cooking, this one's going to be a little more restrained. Mulled wine and a few Christmas cookies. But don't worry, because on Wednesday, for the final lecture, I'll be giving that lecture as a sort of 2025 year in review at the Albright, and we'll have our standard kitchen supper extravaganza then. Fast accordingly. It is a real pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Shulamit Miller. Shulamit is a research and teaching associate at the Institute of Archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She does her fieldwork mostly in the Galilee, where she focuses on late Hellenistic to the early Islamic periods, particularly the sites of Sepphoris and Tiberias. She's the co-author of the recent publication, Sepphoris III, The Temple and the East Church in the Lower City. She came and donated a copy of that to our library not so long ago, which was wonderful. So if anyone wants to read it, you can sit in our library and do so. She's here in residence at the Albright as a NEH, National Endowment of the Humanities Fellow. Alas, one of our final National Endowment of the Humanities Fellows after that whole program was cut by the Doge task force in the United States. However, she's here to do a particular project looking at the publication of Yitzhak Hirschfeld's excavations at Tiberias. This is also funded as part of a publication grant through the Shelby White and Leon Levy Publication Foundation. Shulamit's talking to us today on the rise of Christianity in Galilee, a perspective from the Jewish cities of Sepphoris and Tiberias. Please welcome Shulamit Miller.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And I was also going to give bonus points for those of you who came tonight. And thank you so much for coming out in this cold night. Okay, thank you. Just kind of trying to get my control of the PowerPoint here, and then I will begin my talk. And thank you for everybody here also at the Albright who helped with setting up and taking care of everything, and also just making me feel so much at home here. I have to say that my kind of home at the Albright has been here off and on for the past 20 years. Anna de Vincents, who's also working with me on the publication of Tiberias, brought me here originally, and Cy Gittin kind of offered me odd jobs, and I've been here ever since. So, so I'm very, very happy to finally present also some of my research here at the Albright. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, let's begin. All right. The question, right, of how and when Christianity rose to prominence has long occupied scholarly discourse, focusing on Galilee in late antiquity. And recent studies of Jewish majority cities of the region, Sepphoris and Tiberias, call for a renewed examination of the process of Christianization and the role of cities as agents of religious and cultural change. drawing on a combined reading of literary sources and archaeological materials, I hope today to reassess our understanding of the emergence of Christianity in the Jewish cities, as well as to hopefully provide some insights into the process within the broader socioeconomic context. I will begin by discussing the demographic evidence, for the population of Galilee in late antiquity, defined here as between the 4th and 7th centuries CE. I will then turn to the Jewish majority cities of Sepphoris and Tiberias and begin to discuss the literary sources, the Christian literary sources that deal with these two cities. And I will then examine the archaeological evidence that comes from these two cities and points to the rise of Christianity. And of course, I would say that the Christian faith probably existed in these cities from earlier times, but what I'm looking at specifically is really the rise of institutional Christianity. So we're looking mostly at the construction of churches, chapels, monasteries, buildings that we can actually see had some kind of social organization and sometimes also imperial sanction for their construction. Okay. And once a chronology of the evidence has been basically established, we will also look beyond the Jewish cities to the non-Jewish cities of the region to try to understand if what we see in the Jewish cities is specific to Jewish cities or if it's part of a larger phenomenon. And when I say Jewish cities, not Jewish cities, then first of all, I'd say all cities had mixed populations. Okay, we're not talking about solely one population. We're talking about mixed populations, but we're talking about the majority within the city, right, being one demographic section or not. And finally, I will also look at the social and economic impact of churches. Come on in. I will look at the social and economic impact of church building in late antique cities through the lens of benefaction. And I will try to engage with the idea of church building as a form of public munificence, and that supported the growing dominance of the church as an economic entity transforming the urban landscape. All right, so let's begin with the demography. And the rise of Christianity as an institutional religion began following the Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan in the year 313 CE, in which he pronounced Christianity as an officially recognized religion. Okay, it didn't become the imperial religion until later, but it was a recognized religion already at this time. As discussed by Peter Walker, and I think part of my slide here went away. So I had his book cover up here, but as discussed by Peter Walker, right, in holy cities, holy places, Jerusalem and Bethlehem emerged in the 4th century as foci of Christian interest and activity in the Holy Land. Galilee, however, played only a marginal role in shaping Christian historical consciousness. This is particularly true during the first half of the 4th century CE, as exhibited in the writing of Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius was a native of ancient Palestine and the bishop of his natal city. And he recognized the importance of Galilee as the birthplace of Jesus and the cradle of Christianity, but was in fact little interested in the reality of the places mentioned in the gospel. Okay, he focuses interest on the theological significance of miracles that were performed by Jesus and the apostles throughout the region. So as Walker pointed out, Eusebius was not consistent in his treatment of places. In some cases, he was unsure of the identification, for example, the precise location of Cana, okay, or whether the transfiguration occurred on Mount Tabor or on Mount Hermon. Okay. In other cases, he ignored or limited his discussion of major sites in the gospel, such as Nazareth or Capernaum. And apparently the reason for this is because Eusebius didn't want to discuss the fact that these are very important Christian sites with a Jewish majority that lived in them still in his time. Okay, so it's some kind of like failure of Christianity to dominate that region. The towns and villages in Galilee only began to emerge as places of interest in the next generation of church fathers in the second half of the 4th century CE, when Christian pilgrimage began to develop beyond Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And the writings of Cyril of Jerusalem exemplify the consolidation of Christian narratives associated with Galilee in order to facilitate pilgrimage in a region that still maintained a demographic Jewish majority. Therefore, Christian sites developed in two relatively confined areas. The first was in the central Galilee around Nazareth, includes Nazareth, Mount Tabor, and Cana, and the second encompassing the area of the Sea of Galilee. Okay. A similar picture emerged from the demographic studies based on archaeological excavations and surveys in which ethno-religious markers were identified in the material culture. Jewish presence is identified on the basis of ritual baths, mikvaot, chalkstone vessels, synagogues, and the general use of Jewish symbols. Okay. Christian presence is predominantly determined based on religious buildings, again, churches, chapels, and monasteries, as well as the use of Christian symbols. Synthesizing the data synchronically and diachronically affords insights into the settlement patterns of different religio-ethnic groups in Galilee throughout late antiquity. While we must bear in mind that only sites with specific identity markers could be included in the studies, patterns of settlement distribution emerge nonetheless. And we have here a map that was published in the study of Mordechai Aviam, in which you can see clusters of Christian population that remained limited to the central lower Galilee around Nazareth and the area of the Sea of Galilee during late antiquity, predominantly the 4th and into the 5th centuries CE. Outside of these hubs, the earliest Christian construction began in the polytheistic Western Galilee at the end of the 4th and early 5th centuries, and it intensified significantly towards the late 5th and into the 6th centuries. In contrast, the absence of Christian religious buildings and symbols in Eastern Galilee during the 4th and 5th centuries indicates the region remained predominantly Jewish until the late 5th and 6th centuries CE. In another study conducted by Claudine Dauphin, you can look at ancient Palestine more generally to kind of see the same ideas of what we have here. She specifically took Christians, Jewish, Samaritan, and mixed settlements. And you can see that in the 4th century versus the 5th century, you have a lot less settlements in the 4th as opposed to the 5th. This is probably not because there were less settlements at that time, but because there was less use of religio-ethnic markers during that time. That kind of went and developed over time. So you see, in terms of the ratio of sites, you see approximately the same number of Christian and Jewish sites during both these periods. That, however, changes drastically in the 6th century. As you can see here, we have all of a sudden double the amount of Christian sites than we do Jewish sites. And by the 7th century CE, we only have really Jewish sites in the Eastern Galilee, and the Western Golan. And eventually the Jewish region kind of becomes like little enclaves within this very broad Christian settlement. The resilience of the Jewish community in Galilee in the 4th and 5th centuries is evident from the settlement distribution, the intensity of the construction, and the economic infrastructure. As Lee Levine has shown, the delineation of the province of Palestina Secunda in the early 5th century CE, part of the administrative division of Palestina into 3 provinces at this time, was driven not only by economic and military considerations, but also by demographic ones. In effect, Palestina Secunda, with its capital at Scythopolis, reflects the principal area of the Jewish settlement. The purpose of this administrative configuration was to create conditions under which Jews, as a distinct ethnic group, could participate in and contribute to the economic and political stability of the region. Okay? The provincial territory overlaps precisely with the areas in which Jewish ethno-religious markers appear in the 4th and 5th centuries, which are the southwestern Golan, the Galilee, excluding the Phoenician coast, and the Jezreel Valley. If we analyze these data at different resolutions, we can establish that the presence of ethno-religious markers indicates personal and communal preferences within each village, town, or city, while the provincial borders represent supra-regional imperial decisions, reflecting the importance of the Jewish settlement as a provincial entity. Okay? And from the standpoint of the imperial authorities in the early 5th century, there was no need to Christianize the Jewish region in order for the province, right, and the settlements within it to function integrally as part of the imperial administration. So, having established the gradual process of Christianization across Galilee, we now turn to the Jewish cities of Sepphoris and Tiberias and begin with the Christian literary sources that address specifically these cities and during the 4th century CE. So this is the first kind of wave of contact, let's say, or the wave of attempts of Christianization within these cities. And we will begin with the story of Joseph of Tiberias that is preserved in the Panarion by Epiphanius. Joseph was a Jew from Tiberias who was closely associated with the Patriarchate, and he converted to Christianity and was appointed as comes, or count, by Constantine. It's a fantastical story of religious devotion, of betrayal, of magic, of licentious behavior, and it kind of takes us from Tiberias to Constantinople and back again. And we're not going to get into all of it, but let's look at the section that relates specifically to Tiberias. And the good emperor, that's Constantine, right? A true servant of Christ, made him a count and told him to ask what he wanted in his turn. Josephus asked nothing from the emperor, but this very great favor: permission by imperial rescript to build Christ's churches in the Jewish towns and villages where no one had ever been able to found churches. Okay, so we're learning that this is really the first kind of attempt to build these churches. And he explains why this was unsuccessful before, since there are no Greeks, Samaritans, or Christians among the population, especially at Tiberias, Caesarea Sepphoris, Nazareth, and Capernaum. After receiving the letter and the authorization along with his title, Josephus came to Tiberias. Besides, he had a draft on the imperial treasury, and he himself had been honored with a salary from the emperor. So no lack of funds here. He can go ahead and build his churches. And so he began to build in Tiberias. There was a very large temple in the town already. I think they may have called it the Adrianeum, right? A temple to the Emperor Hadrian. The citizens may have been trying to restore this Adrianeum, which was standing unfinished for a public bath. When Josephus found this, he took the opportunity from it, which means he kind of decided he can take the building materials and reuse the temple, like rebuild the temple into a church as opposed to having it turned into a public bath. And he began the erection of the church. And this is when the magic comes into the story, and the Jews kind of use all of their magical powers against him in order to stop this construction. And he finally uses the symbol of the cross and is able to fight them off. And then we finish up with, though they harmed the man on many occasions, he eventually restored part of the temple at Tiberias and finished a small church, okay? He then left and came to Scythopolis and made his home. However, he completed buildings at Caesarea and at certain other towns, okay? So what we're seeing here really is the story of the first Christianization, but we're seeing more the failure of the first Christianization, attempts, let's say, of Christianization. Okay, the fact that he can't really complete his construction, the fact that he ends up with a small church instead of a very large one, our little kind of footnote here, however he completed buildings in other places, all point to us as critical readers to say, you know, this didn't really work out according to plan. Okay, sorry, that was my bad. Okay. All right, and Sepphoris is mentioned in relation to an interesting phenomenon regarding unruly clergy in late antiquity. So first, some background on this. Christianity was in a very kind of difficult situation in terms of the Christology, the Christological question of Jesus as the Son of God versus God the Father, following the Council of Nicaea, or discussed already in the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. And nearly half a century later, in the year 373 CE, the conflict came to a fore in Alexandria between the Nicene and Arian clergy, and the latter faction was supported by the Emperor Valens. When an Arian bishop came to power in Alexandria, he exiled several members of the Nicene clergy. And most of them were exiled to cities which were considered pagan cities, like, for example, Baalbek or Heliopolis in Lebanon. But a group of 11 bishops were exiled from the Egyptian desert to Sepphoris. Okay. And while this might appear kind of at first glance as the beginning of the Christianization of Sepphoris, I tend to favor Hill and Newman's suggestion that this was actually punishment for these bishops, and they weren't really in contact with the Jewish community of Sepphoris. They were more kind of within the intrigues of the church itself, and being sort of excommunicated in a Jewish city was not something that they could really maneuver and use to their benefit. Moreover, their exile was short-lived, since Emperor Valens died in 378 CE, and then they were reinstated back in their Egyptian monasteries. Interestingly, we have a story of another rogue bishop who was exiled to Tiberias, only apparently that wasn't bad enough because he was exiled again from there. So it's also, we see this kind of use of exile as a form of excommunication and punishment. So we look at now also the epigraphic evidence and see what we actually have, what we know about the first bishops of these cities. And we have inscriptions in the mosaics in pavements of sidewalks beside the two churches in Sepphoris that we'll get to talk about in a minute, mentioning the bishop Eutropius. And he was apparently the first bishop of Sepphoris, and we can kind of date his range of activity no earlier than 461 CE and no later than 521 CE. So we kind of have this late 5th, early 6th century period. And in Tiberias, we have a bishop, Bishop John, who is recorded to participate in synods and in councils already in the mid-5th century CE. So we're probably talking there about that's approximately the period of time that we get the first kind of institutionalized Christianity, at least from the written sources. So now we'll turn to the archaeological evidence from these cities. And we'll see that the archaeological evidence aligns closely with what we see from the texts about actually no real Christian presence in the 4th century, and it only kind of beginning in the 5th and intensifying in the 6th century CE. And to better contextualize these churches within their urban plan, we'll kind of see also what kind of city they were constructed into. So we begin with Tiberias. Right, the urban plan of Tiberias in the 4th century CE largely continued its original Roman period layout. It's kind of constructed in a narrow strip between the Sea of Galilee in the east and Mount Berenice in the west. And the 4th century construction included both new building initiatives as well as continued use and renovation of earlier structures. The Cardo, built in the 1st or early 2nd century CE, continued as the main thoroughfare with adjoining shops. And I brought this plan because it's a beautiful reconstruction by the late Dov Porotsky. Unfortunately, it's not very accurate to what we really know of Tiberias, but it still kind of sets the mood and gives you the idea of what the city on the shore of the lake would have looked like. All right, so the southern gate, right? The southern end of the city was still in use in this period, as well as the bridge over the Wadi that allowed approach from the south into the city. The Roman theater was partially destroyed and then renovated in the early 4th century. We have a room in the eastern side of the theater that has a geometric mosaic, including an inscription within a wreath that mentions the sponsorship, right, by Aurelius Gaius, a citizen of Tiberias. And this act of benefaction reflects the continued Roman civic ergotism or public generosity that is expressed through urban building and development. We also have the bathhouse in Tiberias. It's renovated during this period, kind of constructed with new pools and new water installations, and refurbishing of the peristyle house in the city. So, taking out part of a mosaic, putting one in, changing the pool, but like a continuation of life in the city. A late antique mansion, very large late antique mansion, was built in the late 4th or early 5th century atop Roman dwellings. And this construction overlaid really also part of a 2nd century complex, which may be associated with a temple to Hadrian that was discussed in the source by Epiphanius, right? We have 3 synagogues that are constructed in Tiberias during this time, or constructed or renovated during this time. We have the synagogue Hamat Tiberias. It's the southern suburb of the city, but it's still part of the general municipality of Tiberias. So we see liturgical furniture here that is very Jewish and, of course, was used in this building. We have another synagogue in Hamat Tiberias. The 2A synagogue actually replaces an earlier synagogue, and it is constructed in the later 4th century CE, and it has beautiful mosaics in its floor. We have the panel of Jewish symbols. We have a zodiac with Helios, the sun god Helios at the center, the seasons of the year in the corners. And we also have inscriptions, one of which also mentions Sepphoris, the disciple of the illustrious patriarchs. So we know that the Jewish patriarchate is in Tiberias during this period. And now we also have evidence for people within that kind of very close circle of the, let's say, main Jewish leadership of this time. This synagogue is actually built over by another synagogue. It's enlarged and built over by another synagogue in the 5th century CE. And apparently the growth of the synagogue also reflects the growth of the Jewish population, right? You need a larger building if you have more people who are going to populate it. Further north, within the city of Tiberias itself, a synagogue, also on the kind of northern limit of the city, that goes through various modifications during the 4th and 5th centuries CE. And we see here an inscription of Proculus, the son of Crispus, who donated apparently this part of the mosaic, and it's flanked by the 4 species that are a Jewish symbol associated with the Feast of the Tabernacles. Okay. So this is the background against which the first church in Tiberias is constructed. And we can view this first church, you can see it's really kind of only partially excavated. It was excavated originally by Moshe Hartal and Edna Dalali Amos, and later by Katya Citrin Silverman. It can be dated to the mid 5th century CE. And the building, you have a nave flanked by aisles on either side, and you have this mosaic floor that I'll show you a little bit better. Okay, we have this mosaic floor that includes geometric panels, but also has a few inscriptions in it. We have here an alpha with the omega is probably on the other side. It wasn't exposed on both sides of a cross. We have inscriptions of benefaction and calling names also of the people who donated to this church, who paid, right, as part of the construction, which testifies to the presence of a strong Christian community, apparently, in the city around the mid 5th century CE. And this is also, I'm just going to remind you, about the same time that we have the first bishop of the city is in the mid 5th century. So this could all be, of course, connected together. In the mid 6th century CE, a monastery and church were built on top of Mount Berenike, overlooking the city. And because the construction coincided with the construction of the city walls, this was likely part of an imperial initiative, probably by the Emperor Justinian. And we have the church itself, right, according to the excavator, is Hirschfeld. And you can see in the purple frames is we have a kind of anchor the excavator called this the anchor church because the reliquary of the church was placed within the stone that he identified as an ancient anchor. And whether that be true or not, this was definitely a stopping point for pilgrims who were coming, probably moving east through Galilee from the area of Nazareth and Nazareth and Cana and that whole area towards the Sea of Galilee. And this would most likely be a stop that they would make along the way. Here is that we see much of the same process that we see also in Tiberias of continuation from the Roman city into the 4th century. And we also have damage in Sepphoris by the 363 earthquake. So at the end of the 4th century, the 5th century is kind of an opportunity to rebuild and to rethink how they want to shape their city. And even though they have this opportunity, we don't see Christian construction until the end of the 5th or the early 6th century CE. And I'll just kind of skip along and show you that's part of the Byzantine market. And that's the distribution of domestic areas in Sepphoris. I'm making the best of this. This is really like even what was before. Okay. So, all right, pictures again. The Eastern Church in Sepphoris is constructed above a Roman temple, okay? But the temple went out of use in the 4th century, okay? It was constructed in the 2nd century, went out of use in the 4th century. And the church was not constructed until the end of the 5th or early 6th century. So we have this gap of time. Now, in the 4th century, there's a row of shops that are built along the front area of the temple precinct, blocking the entrance into that area. So the temple was either minimized in its function or went out of use completely as its function. It was just left as an urban monument. However, it was not dismantled until the construction of the church. And let's see if you have this slide. We have this slide. Okay. So here you can see the temple in purple with the church overlaid here in red. So when they do finally take apart the temple, then they take apart all of its building elements, its architectural elements, and even its simple stones, really strip down the temple to its foundation and then build the church from this material. Okay. And we see that this whole construction of the church was part of this urban renewal project in which this bishop, Eutropius, was involved and what he takes credit for. And this project really began from the construction of the churches, which I will hopefully you'll see the other one on the other side of the cardo in a minute. And he takes credit for the construction of these churches, as well as rebuilding of shops along the streets and repaving sidewalks. So it really is this huge project that goes apart in the city in this period. This is the other side of the street. Okay. We have here the Western Church constructed above earlier domestic architecture, elite houses. From the 3rd century, the second phase of the House of Orpheus is rebuilt after the 363 earthquake, continues into use until the 5th century, is abandoned, and then the area becomes a glass workshop. Okay, so we're still not even thinking about Christianity here at the moment, taking over the center of the city space. It's only in the late 5th and early 6th century CE that we see the construction of another church, right, at the same time, same urban renewal project, same Eutropius taking credit for all of this, okay, that gets built over here. Okay, let's hope we can keep going. We can keep going from here. So this is what we see in the Jewish cities, right? I'll kind of just summarize that we see that despite the literary sources that kind of lead us to understand that there's the beginning of Christianization in the 4th century, the archaeological remains don't point to such an early date. I think also critical reading of the sources, you can also see that this is actually happening at a later time. And to better understand, right, the Christianization in the Jewish cities, it's necessary, I think, to kind of expand and see what is happening in the non-Jewish cities in the region. And I've just kind of selected a few case studies to show you from Palestina Secunda itself and from the surrounding area. So we begin with the provincial capital of Scythopolis, right, Bet Shean. And the earliest church is constructed in the late 4th or early 5th century on the northern limit of the city. That's number 5, what you see up there, the Church of St. Andreas. And later on, okay, in the 5th, but mostly the later part of the 5th and the 6th century CE, we have the construction of over 15 churches. Okay, it really depends on which author you're reading, how many churches there are in Scythopolis, but let's say some say over 15, some say over 20, a very large number of churches that are built mostly during the late 5th and 6th centuries. If we go to the other side of the lake from Tiberias to Hippos, okay, we see also here that there are 7 churches that we know about, 5 of which were excavated. The earliest church, okay, dates to the mid-5th century. And the others are dated to the late 5th and especially to the 6th century CE. And we see the same picture basically in other cities of Palestina Secunda, such as in Pella, in Gadara, in Panias. Okay, sometimes we have one early church, like late 4th, early 5th, but most of the construction or the monumentalization of these churches is only later in the late 5th and especially the 6th century CE. And outside of Palestina Secunda, the situation is similar. Okay? We have a single church that is known from Caesarea, right, the capital of Palestina Prima, which is the octagonal church constructed above the podium of the Temple of Augustus in Rome. And it dates to the early 6th century CE. And in the other direction at Jerash, we have at least 25 churches that we know of. And of these, the earliest is the cathedral that is dated to the early 5th century CE. 2 more are dated to the late 5th, and all of the rest of the churches are dated to the 6th and early 7th centuries CE. So I think the evidence shows that Christianization in the non-Jewish cities generally kind of shows the same picture as what we saw in the Jewish cities. And we also see that sometimes, we have construction above temples, oftentimes not directly like the destruction of a temple and then the immediate construction of a church, but this kind of gap of time that gives us this gradual idea of how Christianity is coming into the region in a very kind of slow and lengthy process. And this is true despite, right, this imperial endorsement of Christianity. And I think that the reasons for this have to do with just broader socioeconomic and religious transformations that are, at least in cities, commonly driven by urban elites. And this is going to be the last part of my talk. I'm going to kind of see what we can learn also about these people from the construction of these churches. Okay. In some cases, right, such as in Tiberias, the central church, which was constructed in the mid-5th century, stood in an isolated, right, sort of an isolated Christian monument within an otherwise non-Christian city. And just in general, the urban landscape at this time was really unchanged, right? We have the public bath, we have the houses, we have the theater still in functioning at this time. So all of these are continuing in use from the Roman period. But then we have this church showing us kind of the growing interest in Christianity at this time. By contrast, okay, by the mid-6th century, we have this monastery and church being constructed on the top of Mount Berniki. And this church not only monopolizes the view of the city and the landscape of the city, but it kind of looks out towards the Sea of Galilee at large, right? You'd be able to stand at any point around the Sea of Galilee, look towards Tiberias, and see the church on top of the hill. So there's no question, right, that this church is kind of broadcasting, I would say, Christian authority to the local residents as well as to pilgrims who are coming through the region. And now we're going to have to figure out what we want to figure out again. This is again from Sepphoris. It doesn't like Sepphoris, only Tiberias here. Okay, but but I will kind of skip ahead because I think the next one is good. So in Sepphoris, we have the two churches that are built in the heart of the city center, and they are constructed from the beginning to take over the urban landscape. Okay, they're constructed really at the center, two buildings opposite each other on either side of the street, and the synagogue is still in use at this time, and it's over at the northern end of the city, whereas what we have with the construction of these churches is all of a sudden, like overnight, basically, a Christian city that grows out of this Jewish cityscape. And there's no doubt in my mind that this is a statement that is coming from above and is intended to kind of signify the triumph of Christianity over the local population. So of course, the process of getting there is a long process, but then the actual realization of this kind of happens in a very, very dramatic way. And when we compare the developments of the Jewish and non-Jewish cities, right, the differences appear minimal, all in all. And in my opinion, this is because the polytheistic society and the Jewish society sort of had this modus vivendi. They kind of knew how to live together over time during the Roman period and also into late antiquity. And they each had, I don't know if it was really respect, I don't know if it was friendly all the time, but a way to coexist. And Christianity shook things up in that sense. It kind of brought in a new element to this lifestyle. And I think that the elites who were in these cities at some point, right, they probably were the polytheistic elites, they were probably the Jewish elites. At some point, it became beneficial for them to switch over to actually being Christians. Okay, I'm not saying this is not also an issue of faith, but I think that there's a lot of status and financial gain that came along with the decisions that were made here. And I have to reference also just two articles that were published in the past year, one by Rubina Raja and one by Jacob Ashkenazi, kind of looking at these churches not only as religious buildings, but as power that the elites had and manipulated. And I would like to add to that also by kind of drawing on the social theory of conspicuous consumption, and saying, you know, these are eventually buildings that were used by the elites to show their piety, to show that they were part of this new religion, this new culture, this new socio and economic system, and therefore paying for a church from your own money was very much like what we see in the Roman world in terms of ergotism, that you give in order to get, you donate in order to get recognition. Okay, but they're doing this now through the Christian lens by building churches in order to get recognition. And most likely, especially in cities where we have such large numbers of churches, they probably weren't full. Maybe they weren't even used for more than 1 or 2 days a year. All right, we probably had a very small number of churches that were actually for liturgical use, whereas the statement of the church was there all the time in the urban landscape. So, thank you very much. Thank you for your patience also.